Ludwig van Beethoven. May 7, 1824, Vienna. When the first cold light of morning hit the damp, foggy streets of 19th-century Vienna, the city was waking up to its usual routine, completely unaware that it was on the eve of a monumental turning point in the history of world music. Light-hearted waltzes were already being played on street corners by early musicians, and rehearsals for light operettas echoed in every grand hall, filling the air with a sense of fleeting gaiety. Yet, in sharp contrast to this cheerful facade, in a gloomy, austere and cluttered apartment in the city, a genius was crushed under the immense, almost unbearable weight of that day. Ludwig van Beethoven. He was preparing for his work for the last time, his Ninth Symphony. This was not just another composition. It was his life's work, his final testament, his last great philosophical voice crying out to a divided humanity. He could not hear the music, the sounds of the outside world, the clattering carriages, the street vendors, even the tuning of instruments, were only faint vibrations, muffled hums, or absolute, terrifying silence to him. But today, at the glorious Kartnerter Theatre, this colossal structure composed of tens of thousands of notes, forged in the furnace of his silence, would become the loudest, most profound protest of all time, shaking the foundations of music itself. Beethoven's case was not that of an ordinary composer facing the usual anxieties of a premiere. His struggle was existential. The utter, profound deafness that had continued to worsen since 1818 had ruthlessly cut him off. It had isolated him not only from his beloved profession, the very language of his soul, but also from the simple joys of human connection. His only bridge to the world was his famous conversational notebooks, filled with the hurried scribbles of others. "My connection with music is severed. I am now a guest," he once scrawled in a moment of deep despair. And yet, despite this crushing isolation, this prison of silence, his genius did not stagnate. On the contrary, like a fire deprived of air, it turned inward, burning with an even more exalted, almost violent intensity. The seeds of this symphony, this grand vision of unity, lay hidden decades earlier, planted in his youthful soul by Friedrich Schiller's poem, Ode to Joy. He had admired its message of universal brotherhood since he was a young man, dreaming of a world where it could be realized. With this work now at the end of his career, he wanted not just to write a symphony, a mere collection of movements, but to unite all humanity in the ideal of brotherhood. This was not a work of art. It was a manifesto, a declaration of hope born from despair. But even bringing this manifesto to life, the premiere itself, was a titanic struggle against indifference and chaos. The fickle Viennese aristocrats, once his patrons, had largely forgotten him, chasing newer, lighter trends. So deep was the neglect that he seriously considered an offer to premiere the work in Berlin. This news, when it broke, sparked an artistic uprising among the true music lovers of Vienna. Art lovers, noblemen, and commoners alike wrote him an impassioned letter, imploring him, "You are ours, Beethoven. This work must be born in this land, in the city of music." Beethoven, moved, could not bear to reject the sincerity of that letter. And so May 7th was destined to be the day of triumph for this arduous determination, a victory won against the odds. The morning of May 7, 1824, finally arrived. Beethoven, in his usual rough and disheveled manner, hair unkempt, eyes intense, sat at his cluttered desk, sipping strong coffee, the only stimulant for his exhausted body. His eyes, full of ink stains from sleepless nights of corrections, were fixated on the final score, a battlefield of notes. Outside his window, the sun was shining brightly, and the ticket lines in front of the Kartnerter Theatre were already lengthening, a silent testament to the city's anticipation. His secretary, the ever-anxious Anton Schindler, came to his side, his face pale with worry. He hurriedly leaned over and scribbled into the speech-book. "Maestro, the orchestra is exhausted. We've only had 2 full rehearsals for such a complex work. It is chaos. Please, I beg you, stick to the tempo of Umlauf. Do not confuse them further." Beethoven's forehead bristled with anger as he read the text. He felt the vibration of Schindler's fear. He took the pen roughly, almost tearing the paper, and scribbled a single defiant word in his notebook. Spirit. He would direct not the mere notes, not the technical tempo, but the very soul, the unconquerable spirit of the music. When his servant Karl brought his heavy wool coat, prepared for the evening air. The tension on Beethoven's face was set like a rigid mask. He was a general preparing for his final battle. He braced himself internally for what he knew would come, but could not hear. The loud voices of the gathered crowd, the frantic gestures of the musicians, the inevitable chaos of the orchestra trying to follow a deaf conductor. But none of this sensory overwhelm would ever reach his silent world. As he walked out the door of his apartment, a heavy premonition settled upon him. He sensed that this day would be, paradoxically, both his greatest triumph and his greatest, most isolating sorrow. The backstage of the Kartnerter Theater that evening was like a battlefield before the first shot. More than 100 musicians, a massive chorus, and 4 terrified soloists were trembling with palpable tension. The air was thick with anxiety. Principal violinist Michael Umlauf, a respected musician, would stand beside the unpredictable Beethoven, acting as the shadow conductor, the true anchor for the ensemble. The young, talented alto soloist Caroline Unger, her voice shaking, whispered to Umlauf just before they walked onto the stage. "We must trust each other, Michael. We cannot trust him. We must follow you." Her fears were well-founded, born of painful experience. At the final rehearsal, just hours before, Beethoven had become completely detached from the orchestra for several agonizing seconds during a complex transition. His arms were flailing, cutting the air at a wildly wrong tempo, while the musicians struggled to stay together, their eyes darting in panic. Umlauf had to physically stop him, tapping his arm, and write in capital, desperate letters in a notebook held up for him to see. "The tempo is wrong. You will destroy us all. Follow me." The memory of that near disaster hung heavy in the air. But Beethoven's presence on that stage, despite everything, despite the errors, the deafness, the fear, was a monolithic source of strength. He wasn't just gesturing time. He was proclaiming the soul of the music with his entire being, with his convulsing body, the deep, furious frown of his eyebrows, the wild tossing of his tousled gray hair. He was stone deaf, yet his sheer, indomitable presence gave 1,000 voices, a unified soul, to an orchestra that feared him. A silence fell over the packed theater, a silence so profound and expectant you could hear a pin drop in the furthest balcony. Beethoven stood at the podium, a solitary figure in a world of sound he could not enter. Umlauf was to his right, his eyes fixed like a hawk on the orchestra, ready to take control. The great symphony began. First movement, darkness. A storm of cosmic rebellion and personal tragedy erupted from the instruments. Beethoven flailed his arms with the fury of a titan, as if commanding the very universe's rebellion against his fate, channeling his own rage into the music. Second movement. A frenetic, driving rhythm took over, the raw, untamed energy of life itself. Beethoven's feet were tapping hard against the stage floor, trying desperately to feel the vibrations of the rhythm he could not hear with his ears. Third movement. Adagio then, a sublime piece descended, carrying the sorrow of the world on its gentle wings. As the soft, lyrical string sounds flowed like a healing balm through the hall, Beethoven's tense face softened for the first time. He closed his tired eyes, turning inward, and heard the perfect, unblemished music resonating within his own soul. And then, the fourth movement. One of the most shocking, revolutionary moments in musical history burst forth. That peaceful adagio was suddenly, violently shattered by a terrifying, discordant scream from the wind and brass sections. The strings harshly, almost brutally, rejected the preceding themes of peace and sorrow, demanding something new, something more. The audience sat in stunned, breathless shock. In the midst of that carefully composed musical chaos, a baritone singer rose from his seat. A human voice. A solitary human voice, which until that moment had had no place in the sacred realm of a symphony. That revolutionary line rang out, a clarion call. "Oh friends, not these sounds. Let us strike up more pleasing, more joyful ones." In that instant, music ceased to be merely an abstract art form. It became humanity's own voice, its own desperate, beautiful plea for joy and connection. When the massive chorus stood and began to thunderously sing Schiller's great poem, Ode to Joy, the Kartnerter Theater was no longer just a stage for performance. It had been transformed into a temple of human spirit, a sanctuary of hope. The chorus was belting out the final, ecstatic climax, their voices intertwining in a glorious hymn. The orchestra was playing with all its might, every musician pouring their soul into the sound. The music seemed to physically soar, lifting the roof of the theater, ascending into the Viennese sky, a prayer for all mankind. And then with a final, thunderous chord, the music ended. The last vibration faded. The theater erupted instantly. It was pandemonium. Applause like rolling thunder, screams of bravo. Thousands of people rising to their feet as one, waving hats and handkerchiefs. The very ceiling seemed to shake with the force of their adulation. But in front of the podium, a man, Beethoven, stood motionless. He stared at the score, his back to the hall. He could neither hear the noise nor perceive the excitement. The applause was non-existent for him. At that moment, Caroline Unger rewrote the history of the stage. She hurried over to Beethoven, took his arm, and gently turned him toward the audience. Beethoven saw it with his own eyes. A wild outpouring of love, waving hands, throwing hats, waving handkerchiefs. He was given 5 standing ovations. Even the imperial family at the time would applaud at most 3 times. That moment was the most intense mixture of sadness and triumph. Tears streamed down the weary cheeks of a deaf genius. Beethoven was deaf, but that day with his notes he heard all time. May 7, 1824, went down in history as the day not only of premiere, but the eternal proclamation of humanity's greatest hope and the struggle of a genius.